Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from the Lone Bellow, titled Then Came the Morning. You know, for as much as I advertise myself as one of the few critics on YouTube who bothers to cover country music, I really haven't been doing that good of a job on that lately. So let's change that, shall we? Now, to be fair to myself, there's not really a lot that's out right now in terms of country. January tends to be a bit of a fallow period for the mainstream, and oh god, the country charts are reflecting that as we're getting third and fourth singles from various artists landing traction where in most worlds they would never reach the charts with these songs. It's gotten so bad that Sam Hunt's bad pop disguised as worse country and Cole Swindle's flavorless mush is still rising up the charts, and that's just wrong on so many levels. So in the meantime, let's talk a little bit about the indie scene, and let's start with the Lone Bellow, a Brooklyn-based trio that I probably should have covered when their debut dropped in 2013 that just kind of slipped the net. And while I'm not usually one to point fingers and say that country should only come from Nashville or Texas or Calgary or Edmonton, if you were to imagine a group that sounded like Brooklyn indie folk dabbling in a bit of snarled country rock and soul-inspired vocals, the Lone Bellow should jump to mind. A lot of plucky guitars and banjos that call to mind your standard Mumford & Sons wannabe, slightly softer distortion than the Drive-By Truckers or Sunday Best, and a male-female dichotomy that reminds me more than a bit of Little Big Town before that band went crazy on Painkiller. But how do I feel about the Lone Bellow? Well, they're pretty good, and they tend to avoid most of the pretentious nonsense that puts me off a fair chunk of that recent brand of folk rock, but that first album always seemed to lack the textures, grit, and real heft in the songwriting, edge, and nuance that would characterize other Americana-inspired acts, like, say, Doug Paisley or Bill Callahan. In fact, the group they reminded me the most of was the Civil Wars, a group I mostly respected who wrote some very pretty songs that occasionally had some real moments of wit and heart, but for the most part they made very tasteful, pretty, safe music that never moved or interested me at least as much as I wanted them to. But I figured, hey, it's their debut. Originally written off as songs from frontman Zach Williams that he put together on his own. Give him a little bit more time and a producer can push their choral vocals into some real harmonies and their instrumentation to a little bit more grit, and we could have something special here. And when I heard they were working with Aaron Dessner from The National, I thought it was a perfect match, and I definitely sought out their sophomore record, Then Came the Morning. How is it? Well, if we're looking for an album that shows a band with entirely too much direction to the point where pinning down what the hell the Lone Bellow was trying to do with this record, I'd point to this. And this has less to do with lyrics than instrumentation, which leads to a confused, messy album that really can't decide what Americana-inspired indie folk rock act it's trying to be. Instead of trying to go for one or go for a unique sound, it tries to sound like all of them and ends up being all the more lackluster for it. Which really does disappoint me because there are ways they could have set themselves apart with this album, and it just does not happen the way it should. So in other words, while it's not a bad record, it is a disappointment, at least for me. I think the most important place to start here would be in the vocals. See, the Lone Bellow, they easily have a unique sound in their scene thanks to use of male and female singers to structure their harmonies. And yet, instead, on this record, we get, more often than not, low-rent interplay that could have been pulled off of the more reserved cuts from Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros. Hell, frontman Zach Williams even reminds me a little bit of Alex Ebert in his vocal tone and his delivery, except minus the overblown howling bombast that gave some of that retro psychedelic band some of their charm. I definitely prefer the moments where they chose to give Canine Douche Le Pipkin a little bit more vocal presence, as though a ragged alto as the band some desperately needed vocal edge. Hell, I like Brian Elmquist's richer, more country-flavored vocals a fair bit too, especially on the acoustic ballad Watch Over Us, where he was pretty much the saving grace of that song. And while his upper range is a little thin, at least his voice fits the sound of this album a little bit better than Williams' very thin timbre. But even with that, the harmonies are nowhere near intricate or interesting as they could have been. And in my common complaint with groups like this, they rarely make the most of the male-female dichotomy in their songwriting to tell more of a story or set up more unique scenarios. You'd think, for as many indie folk acts as the Lone Bellow were trying to imitate, Of Monsters and Men could have been one of them. They could have done something more here and they didn't. But really, what I was excited about on this record going into it was the instrumentation and the production. So how's that? Well, it is better. Aaron Dessner's touch is pretty unmistakable as the sounds are rougher and more textured, a little bit more percussion heavy, but it also reminds me more than a bit of, really? A lot of the sound and approach of this album is very reminiscent of early albums from The National, especially with the alternative country elements. But really, it's here where the hodgepodge of elements that the Lone Bellow tried to incorporate get even more scattershot. On the one hand, you get stabs at soul with the title track, or the stronger, colder as it is with the horns, organ, and strings, or the lounge vibe of diners, even the surprise surprisingly punchy blues grime of Heaven Don't Call Me Home that show that the Lone Bellow could kick a little bit more ass if they tried. But on some level, the presentation of these alternative genres, they lack some teeth, either in the vocals sounding a little bit too composed or in not bringing enough of the rough guitars more to the surface. They just don't connect in the way they should with me. The more country flavored songs, they are better, with a little bit more steel guitar and some ragged strings on tracks like Fake Roses, Call to War, or the smoky sound of If You Don't Love Me. But here I can't help but think that if you added a little bit more reverb, some of these songs would be rejected cuts from the War on Drugs. I'm definitely glad they added more sizzle to some of these songs and amped up that percussion on tracks like Take My Love, but many of these songs rely on building to these heavy swelling crescendos like you typically get in a lot of modern folk rock. And yet, bizarrely, they rarely raise a lot of impact with me whatsoever. Some of it might actually be an issue with the production. For as much as an edge as Dessner manages to add, we rarely ever reach those moments of raw, powerful climax. It's an issue that comes up in some of the mix balance as well. For as much as I do like the steel guitar, putting it ahead of the guitar solo instead of allowing it to accent the sound on Diners, I'm sorry, that was a mistake, because it completely dampens the impact of that guitar solo and it really weakens the song. It doesn't help matters that the sequencing of this album feels haphazard at best. Keeping momentum is a real problem when you undercut so much of this album with acoustic ballads that can rarely sustain the impact of the other tracks. And all that comes back to is an issue of the songwriting. And look, the writing's not bad. Hell, I'd argue that they got a knack for moments of detail to set a scene that most folk or mainstream country seems to have lost in recent years in favor of pretentious bullshit or obnoxious pandering to the lowest common denominator. And you know, on a technical level, the poetry is good. It flows well, the rhyming is mostly solid, if a little basic. The songs, they fit together. But even though this album does take some stabs at rougher and slightly darker subject material, loneliness, breakups, relationship trouble, you get the picture, the writing can't help but feel a little bit sanitized for me. Never quite vulnerable or raw enough in this particular brand to really connect. Part of this is in the framing, is that there are several songs that sidestep any actual blame or problems that might be with our narrator, the title track being a prime example of this. Now sure, I get that there's a certain catharsis at playing a breakup song like a triumphant anthem, but the writing of the track just comes across as resoundingly petty to me. Or take the hookup track Take My Love, where he tries to win over a girl, and yet in the second verse we get the lyrics, when you told me you can't sleep, count your sins instead of sheep, count the ways you feel weak, but that's not what I see. Did Lone Bellow borrow a songwriter from One Direction here? Because lines like that come across as patently disingenuous by negging his prospective girl before managing to win her over somehow. On Marietta, we get the long-suffering boyfriend willing to wait for a flighty girl to come back because he's just so patient. On Diners, we get an ex acting out recklessly as a result of the breakup with our narrator. And If You Don't Love Me is a kiss-off song that might as well be retitled Dump Me Already and Get It Over With. You know what's probably one of the better songs here? The one track where there seems to be any sort of real self-awareness behind the writing is on the closing track, I Let You Go, where there's some regret being shown at letting an ex go, thinking that she'd come back when she didn't. But beyond that, all the writing here is so thin, it just doesn't connect with me whatsoever. Now, to be fair, that's not saying there aren't songs that I like here. Fake Roses does a pretty solid job in capturing the loneliness of being left behind, even though the interjection of a narrator playing the consoling party during the bridge does undercut that. Call to War takes a fighting for love metaphor and manages to stretch the song to make it work. And Heaven Don't Call Me Home, it's a pretty solid basic blues stomper that manages to be a fair bit of fun. But look, when push comes to shove, They Came the Morning by the Lone Bellow, it's a sophomore slump, and a pretty disappointing one at that. What I find with every re-listen to this record is a band that has no idea what it wants to be to really distinguish itself. Instead, grabbing elements wholesale with little cohesion and trying to fuse them into a workable sound. And without a clear artistic direction, you get mixed results that often turn more to dull and underwhelming than outright bad. The sad fact is I can't even say this music isn't for me, because when Hozier or The National find ways to make very similar collections of sounds from different genres work amazingly well, I'm just forced to say that the Lone Bellow, they're just not on the same level here. That said, this album, for me, it's still passable thanks to solid enough production and some good songwriting. So it's getting a 6 out of 10, but only a recommendation if you want a softer, slightly more country-inspired version of an early record from The National or something from the Civil War's a little bit more roughness. Why you'd want that, I'd have no idea, but hey, to each their own, I guess. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Just warning you guys, I've got a really couple busy weeks coming up in the next couple weeks for reasons I will announce later. But this means that I'm gonna have to really focus on cutting to the records that I really want to cover. And I'm probably not gonna be able to take as many suggestions, unfortunatatory. Billboard Breakdown's still gonna run as scheduled, but it's gonna be a little bit tighter for me. Beyond that, though, if there's any albums you think I really should cover, particularly kind of any country albums, because they're kind of short on that this far this year, please let me know in the comments, or if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation. I'm all ears. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.